Technology company. I'll say that anyway, Deborah.
Thanks.
ByNomix. And a very inspiring honours student, Anmol Saini, who I must say is taking time out of writing his thesis, which is due next week. And I think if any of you at that stage will appreciate that's a big sacrifice to give. Unfortunately, Karen Reynolds, Professor Karen Reynolds, who's in the medical device academic sector, couldn't join us today because of a family illness. But I think between us we'll all cover any questions that you have and that I might ask the panel. What we're going to do, we're not giving slides and so forth. I'm going to ask our panellists to give a very brief 5-minute snapshot of what they do and how they came to be where they are. And then we will open up and ask questions, and plenty of time for you to ask questions, so I encourage you to do so. In fact, if you want to ask a question at any time, put your hand up and we'll interrupt and take a question. Do we have microphones for the audience, or does the audience just have to shout? You're over there. Great, Nikki. Great. Good. Well, and myself, let me introduce myself. I'm from the biotechnology sector as well. A previous ag science degree originally, but then into medical research. Brief time in academia, then set up Child Health Research Institute, an independent medical research institute. Then I've run cooperative research centres which bring together industry and research, and finally set up a biotechnology company. Then I thought I was getting a bit more time back in my life, and I was tapped on the shoulder to be what is now my dominant role, at least for the last 3 years, of Chief Scientist for South Australia. People say, congratulations, what's that? Good question. I give advice to the government on how to build the capability of science in the state, how to take that science through to its application for our industries, and how to help us develop more people students going into the STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths areas. So it's a great privilege. You get to look at all sorts of things. Today it might be cybersecurity, tomorrow it might be the green hydrogen economy. And I think that's an important message I would give to you, and that when you learn science subjects, and particularly if you go on to do research, as Anmol will tell you, what you actually learn is to solve problems. And that ability can be applied to all sorts of things. So I feel quite comfortable working in the area of cybersecurity and so forth. Don't always speak the language, but I know people who do, so that's all right. So you learn to problem solve, and you may not even stay in a science-related career, and I don't think that matters at all, because people, lots of heads of companies, Wesfarmers, for example, Angela Merkel is a PhD, never having done anything in business or anything else, but have done science or engineering training. It's a hell of a skill base to build on. And the other point I'll say just before handing over to Deborah to tell a bit about her background is that somebody said something to me this morning I thought was actually quite good for those of you thinking about where you might go in a career. And it's very daunting. As I said, you don't know where you're going to head. I didn't know I was going to set up a biotechnology company or become chief scientist. But you ask yourself, what drives you? What makes you get up in the morning? And ask yourself 3 things. Am I a heads person? Am I a hands person? Or am I a people person? Now, of course, you'll be everything across that. And I would say anyone in this room, and since you have an interest in this area, has to be a heads person. But what else makes you? Are you really a people person? Do you love to interact with other people? In which case, going and working at a computer all day and staring at that screen is probably not for you. Conversely, if you're a bit more of the, what we call the classic nerdy type who just wants to bury yourself in something, that may well appear. That's a straight, heady type person. If you're a hands person, you might want to become an engineer. You might want to do a trade. Deborah was telling me earlier that a relative of hers just finished a degree and now is going on to do an apprenticeship. So, and I think if you can think about that early on, what drives me? And every time you come to these things, think, is this the direction for me? Because intrinsically, that's what's going to get me out of bed in the morning. And I thought that was pretty good advice. So let me now introduce Deborah. Deborah joined the company ByNomix the ByNomix, which is based out at the Theberton Bioscience Precinct, from a company called Peptech Limited, which was headquartered in Sydney. And she was General Manager of Business Development and Licensing, and she invented some of the technology for the company that underpinned that, and was very effective in defending those patents. And I think that's an example. I'm sure Deborah hasn't done any intellectual property law training.
Zero.
So, yet here she was
writing
patents and defending them, because that training in scientific methodology helped her so much in that way. So she's got a lot of experience now in building companies, finance, merger acquisitions, as well as therapeutic product development and the business development, licensing, commercialisation, all of those things learnt on the job. She has a whole range of awards that I will take up the whole hour to tell you, so I won't go into those. But she's certainly been included in the top 50 most influential Australian business women, so someone to aspire to. So, Deborah, would you like to give us a bit of more of a background on yourself?
Sure. Maybe I'll talk about my company a little bit, because it's a company that I think is pretty reflective in the biotech industry of the sorts of careers that young people, when they're looking at doing science, maths and related subjects in Year 12 might think about. So ByNomix is, as Leanna indicated, based in the tech precinct down at Theberton. We've been around for about 17 years. We're listed on the Australian Securities Exchange with a market cap of around $200 million. We employ about 100 people globally here in Adelaide and also in France. What we do is discover new drugs to treat illnesses like Alzheimer's disease, anxiety, depression, pain, and different types of cancers. And we're really at that cutting edge of new drug discovery. Our business model is a little different. You can think of us in some ways as being a mini pharmaceutical company, but at this point we don't actually manufacture things, and we don't market them, and we don't sell them. Our main product is in fact our patents, our intellectual property. And as scientists in our company develop their programs and discover what could become a new treatment for pain, for example, they become involved in the patenting process and in the patenting of their discoveries. Our business model at this point is to undertake that early stage work. You could say it's from bench to patient. And once we've done, for example, phase 2 clinical trials, where we've got some sort of proof of biology, proof of concept that a new approach, a new therapeutic candidate might be beneficial to patients, then we form an alliance, a joint venture, we call it a partnership, under a licensing agreement with a much larger company, who then continues on the development of that drug, and they'll be responsible ultimately for the manufacture and the marketing. Obviously, our team has to be aware of the end use of the product. Our team has to be aware, for example, of the reimbursement landscape. So is our drug going to be so competitive that it's going to beat other drugs in the class and gain reimbursement in the US? Is it going to be eligible for reimbursement here in Australia under the PBS? We do get involved in some early manufacturing to undertake our clinical trials. So we have people in the company who are experts in that kind of work, as well as the discovery stage. And of course, we have people who run our clinical trials. As I said, we're sort of an idea of some of the breadth of careers that you can have if you study science, technology, engineering and maths. And of course, you can be the CEO of the company as well, because my background is as a scientist. I studied, I have a BSc, I had an honours year where I studied immunology, and then I went on and did a PhD in immunology. Unfortunately, immunology, immune disease, is not necessarily an area that ByNomix is focused on at the moment. Our areas are mostly in the CNS, in the brain, and also in oncology, in cancer. I came to a career in industry through a rather interesting path, and it was at a time when the industry in Australia actually wasn't really established. It was pretty nascent. It was really probably at the birth of the Australian biotech industry. So the company that I joined first up, Peptech, was, I think, probably the second biotech company to list on the Australian Securities Exchange, and that was back in 1986. So I've seen, obviously a lot of changes since then. So we now have around 130 biotech companies listed on the ASX. The market capitalisation of all those companies is about $100 billion, and the exports of products from the industry, the pharma and biotech industry, have grown exponentially, so that actually now equals the peak of the car industry in its heyday. So there are lots of interesting topics to discuss there. I'll stop and hand over to our colleague here to talk about his work as a student and his hopes.
And before you start, Anmol, let me just say, as I mentioned, Anmol is an honours candidate at the University of Adelaide. He's in the obstetrics and gynecology area and working on a research project trying to improve the effectiveness of IVF for in vitro fertilisation for embryos. He's had promising results so far in animal studies and is hoping to head to clinical trials. I think what's interesting too, I think, as a background, is that Anmol came here from India when he was 14, I think. And I think those are big steps that you make. And I would say another lesson I would say is where you really learn is when you take those big steps into the unknown. You might be a bit nervous and say, oh, I'm not ready for this. You never will be for, I think, some of the big challenges. But everything I look back and say, gee, where did I actually learn? I learned a lot when, for example, I went into the Child Health Research Institute to run that as a new institute. And I remember a board director asking me about the balance sheet, financial balance sheet. And I said, what's a balance sheet? But I've learned a lot about finances since then. So I often say naivety is a bit of a good thing. But he's also taken on roles as a tutor and actually been setting up a company back in India. So a real diversity and very entrepreneurial, clearly, and I think a great role model. So,
thank you, Dr. Reid. So hello everyone. As Dr. Reid said, my name is Anmol and I'm an honours student at the University of Adelaide. And at the moment I have a passion of developing my knowledge into the field of human reproductive science. Apart from that, I'm associated with two companies back in India. So one is into marketing and sales, and recently we have ventured into hospitality business. And I think at the moment, just over we employ 200 employees at the moment. And that's quite growing every year. Apart from that, when I started university or when I finished my high school, I wasn't even sure what area to go in the health sector. Like I knew I wanted to go in this sector, but not sure what degree or what area to like specialization. I was looking into the degree at the University of Adelaide and I came across health and medical science, which while reading the description quite attracted me. So I went along, I'm like, okay, that should be a good part of my journey, and if I don't like it, I'll just change it to some other degree. While I progressed into that study, I came across my passion of research into genetics and reproductive health, and which I think is quite a growing area at the moment as well. So from on there, I took on to the research area as well, and then on to my honours as well. But apart from research area, when I have got time outside my lab, I'm also a tutor at the School of Medicine, so tutoring nursing and the health science students as well, and also a student ambassador with the university. So I'd go to different high schools and interact with future students coming as well as a volunteer at the Faculty of Health and Medical Science and give one-on-one tutoring to the indigenous students that are coming to the university. So I think I like to diversify, and going from research and then going to different businesses area. I think I'm still learning, and as being a young entrepreneur, it's really hard things, and it still keeps me up in the night. But I think it's all a part of the learning and adaptability, which I would say is quite helpful.
And just following that up, Anmol, then, what made you decide to do an honours degree, and what's your advice to the people in the audience about, you've done a degree, what could you do with a degree, and what does an honours degree add to that?
When I enrolled into university, I never thought I'm going to do my honours until my final year, actually. I was interacting with my supervisor. It was on a glass of wine, and I think the project that came across was quite fascinating to me. But I think a difference between an undergraduate and a big honours would be you get your hands onto research experience. So you're not sitting on your lecture theatre, or you go to tutorials, or you go to exams. You are learning in a lab. You're learning from your quite expertise supervisors who are leaders in the field, who are expertise in the field, and then you learn from them, and you learn, and like we said, it's part of the research, say analysis you do, and some experiments work, some experiments fail. So is that capability you develop over the time is quite helpful as well.
Mm-hmm. And Deborah, following it up, in your company, how many people would have honours degrees at all, I guess, and also PhD? Why would you go on and do a PhD, and what's the balance, say, in your company of those types of people, and what do they, what's a day in the life of those different types of people?
A day in the life is quite diverse of each of the different groups within our organisation. So to work in the laboratory as a research assistant, typically you have an honours degree, because the honours degree gives you that year in the lab doing a research project, solving a problem, and it's more independent learning. And that's important when it comes to working within a lab. It also helps build your teamwork as well, which hopefully has started during the undergraduate years. But the vast majority of our staff at the entry level working in the laboratories would have an honours degree. We're partly in the privileged position that we're an employer who takes scientists, and there are a lot of students and graduates looking for jobs here in Adelaide. So we do, to some degree, get to pick the cream of the crop in Adelaide, which is a nice position to be in. I guess the other thing is that, for example, Lauren Nicotra, who organised our stand here at the JobX and organised all of ByNomix participation here, she has a PhD in pharmacology, and she's just completing a law degree at Adelaide University. And her role is not in the lab. Her role is managing a very key relationship for ByNomix with a global pharmaceutical company, Merck & Co, in our strategic partnership. And then she manages all sorts of other relationships for us, so that she can bring her science training to bear on those sorts of areas, including investor relations, for example. The other area is utilising her interest in law, and that is becoming involved in our in-licensing and out-licensing efforts, being a support to myself and to our legal counsel, in-house legal counsel, in those initiatives. So looking at some of our contracts and our agreements there. And then we've got our clinical development team. They come from interesting backgrounds, master's degrees, for example, additional training in project management, which the company's provided, and some of them go on and do an MBA, for example, a master's in business administration. So I guess you're getting the picture here that it's actually about lifelong learning. It's a combination of both your formal training, but also that formal training can occur while you're working within the company, and we support employees in that effort. But also, you know, we identify specific talent in the company, and we want to try to have people develop their careers. So we do give them those extra opportunities to learn on the job as well, whether it's patents, whether it's about clinical trials, whether it's about other things around alliance management, for example.
And following that up, I guess there's quite a bit of criticism around at the moment of the fact that people are going through a number of degrees, and probably the biological sciences is an example of that. So many people are doing it, but what are the jobs out there? It's certainly, you go through even doing a PhD, and you're trained in probably in the like of your academic supervisors and so forth. There aren't too many tenured positions around in future. That ain't the future. It's a very different situation in some other countries. Germany, for example, has a real thriving small company industry that is linked into universities, and there's a natural progression across to that industry sector, much more than we have here. It's growing, and it's growing in this sector quite well. Deborah, and then I'll ask Anmol to think towards the future as well about this question, is if you were trying to position yourself to be able to have a job in industry, having gone through these biotech, health sciences and so forth directions, what could people do to help themselves get across the line with a job in your company, for example?
One of the things that a number of people do is they will just send their resume. They'll send an email and say that they're interested in this area as a career. What opportunities are there? They may not have seen an advertisement out there, but they're interested, and so they just write a letter and submit an email with their CV. And we do have, from time to time, unpaid internships over the December-January period, and if our staff have got the capability over that period, then we might take on 1 or 2 or 3 people as an unpaid intern, and have them go through a bit of a program. We do that for high school students in year 12 too. They quite often approach us, but it's more of a week-long sort of program. I think the main thing is to put yourself out there. I know that it's tough to get rejection, but try not to be afraid of that. I think be persistent, try and be resilient and persist if that's something that you really want to do. Cast a pretty wide net, and sometimes think about peripheral things that will get you ultimately to where you might like to be. And I think sometimes not having a plan is also good. I'm mentoring a young PhD student at the moment, and I think one of the things that I had to have had to impart is that I didn't necessarily have a big grand plan of where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do, but I just took opportunities that really filled me with excitement and went after the opportunity. So I took a lot of risks in my career, and you learn a lot through doing that. But I think persistence is really important for the new job seeker, particularly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about formal training in business? Should science graduates be doing courses in entrepreneurship, in business management, and so forth? Anmol, did you do anything like that in your degree?
No, I never. It was just a part of the learning, and like Deborah said, just being persistent. And I was trying. As the opportunity came through my way, I just grasped onto it, and I learned different things from it. But I guess having a science background, then having a sort of business background, I just learned from my day-to-day life. And sometimes I fall, I learn from it, and then I got back up. So I think in business as well, it's just learn from your past experience as well. And when I interact with the high school students, that's what I say to them. When any opportunity that comes to us, just grasp onto it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, at least you can learn some lessons from it and then move on to the next one. But I think it's just the experiences that would count a lot in life as well.
One of the things I'd say too is that we tend to have a mentality in Australia of I'm training to be an employee. Then what about starting up your own companies? I think that entrepreneurial spirit could use a bit of improving in Australia. So you go through your degree and say, well, gee, there aren't the jobs around. What about starting up your own company and thinking about that side of it? Not straightforward, not easy, and that's why I think perhaps if you're going through a degree, all the universities now are thinking more about entrepreneurship training. So entrepreneuring, being your own boss. I mean, Anmol, you're an obvious entrepreneur. You've started up some companies and so forth. You may not have done formal training, but you've taken a parallel path that I imagine has actually been very valuable to you.
Yes, it's definitely, and I think, like I was said before, I like to diversify, and I think I was at a expo over here, and I was listening to Flavia, who's the CEO of the Space Technologies, and she's mentioned that as a part of your training or as being an entrepreneur, you have to network a lot. Sometimes you just network like you like networking, but sometimes you learn some valuable lessons just meeting from someone, and then you can use those lessons while you meet someone else. So I think I've over the years, as a part of my business and as a part of being a science student, I've learned the importance of networking, and I think I've learned some lessons from it and then implemented that to my business model and then went on from there.
Mm-hmm. Any questions from the audience? Please.
Actually, directed to all.
Might want.
Deborah, you said that you sort of drifted through science. My questions are sort of around, or actually point of discussion, is aspiration, inspiration and vision. So your company has obviously got a vision for you to excel and differentiate yourself. So businesses do that and individuals can do that as well. So,
Yes.
Leanne, you said also that you did ag science before going in doing other science degrees. I'm just intrigued as to what drove you down that path, and once again answering aspiration, inspiration and vision. Is that too broad?
Do you like it? Well, I guess in my case, I drifted into ag science. I think I was going to be a vet. You couldn't do vet science in South Australia at that time, and interstate universities didn't take many people. So I thought, I'll do ag science. Like animals. It really was about like that. I like science a lot. Actually, it goes back. I often say the importance of good teachers is. I actually went to high school, technical high school, to be a hairdresser, and my first year science teacher was just so inspirational that I went home. Okay, now I'm neuroscience today, Mum. Oh, okay, dear. Whatever. And that's what. And those quality of teachers along the way drove me. So a little bit drifting in to do that. What I started to realise, I think, along the way was, for the reasons that Anmol mentioned, doing research, being independent. I was not going to have a career where I just sort of said, here's a recipe, do this work, which if you're a technician with no, I guess, university training, probably that's what you'll do. I had to be more in charge of things, so hence went to honours, PhD and so forth. I think what I realised, I quit Adelaide University actually as a tenured lecturer the day my tenure came through, which was total coincidence. But I realised that teaching is very important, but it's not for me. I like to do things. I want to put science into practice. You don't know these things often. I didn't know that I was going to be like this, so you sort of drift in part and you make some changes here and there along the way. So that's the sort of path that I took, really, that starting to realise when you get a feel for what you do, because how do you know till you've done an honours degree or something what an honours degree means? It's a hard thing to comprehend. You start to go in certain directions. So that's driven me all along. Going to a cooperative research centre, putting science into practice means going more towards industry than just doing straight basic research. So it's all important. Everyone's just different. You, Deborah?
I think that's absolutely true. For me, as I said, I came in at the beginning of the biotech industry, and I was actually didn't have a particular career objective in mind when I decided I would do honours, and then when I decided I would do a PhD. I was actually driven more by the intellectual challenge. So it was a very internal thing for me at that point. Along the way, like Leanna, I met some inspirational people, and people who were not inspirational, but actually more challenging, who perhaps really, asked me all the hard questions. And I had some mentors along the way as well who didn't give me the answers, but really challenged me to find my own answers. And I think that helped. But the other thing about being a scientist is that you're in a global community right from your honours degree. You're not just working at your lab at Flinders or University of SA or Adelaide University or wherever. You are actually part of a global community. And you do begin to think globally, because you've got to put your work effort into that context and to differentiate yourself as a scientist. And I wanted to be part of that global community. So that was my initial thinking, that I wanted to be really good at that, and I wanted to be part of that global community. And because it was the beginning of the biotech industry, a lot of the best science, the really hot science that was being done at that time, was being done in newly formed startup companies in the US. They're now mega pharmaceutical companies like Genentech and Amgen and a few others that are no longer around, that have been acquired. But they were doing just the best science in my chosen area. And so I really came to this idea that there could be this great fusion of science and business very early on. And so I made the choice. It was a risky move at the time, and my supervisor at the time was actually quite upset that I made the move from a pure academic path into an industry track. So it wasn't well regarded when I'd actually done that. It was like I was moving to the dark side. But for me, it was actually just being able to do the best science possible. And of course, by doing the best science possible, you're discovering things and you get involved in patents. And to be involved in patents, again, you've got to understand that global language, and you've got to understand the business. So I just started to learn how to talk the business language and get involved in business discussions from there. I did start to do an MBA, but I've never finished it. So I don't think you necessarily have to have an MBA. I think most of my learning has been on the job. So follow your passion. Don't be afraid to take risks, and take a path that other people, that you don't necessarily have a role model for. I actually had no role model for taking the path that I've taken. And then the vision now, of course, is just trying to grow that industry within Australia, not just ByNomix, but I'm a firm believer that if the industry as a whole is successful, then that will be to the greater benefit of Australians. As I said, the industry now, in terms of export earnings, exceeds the car industry in its heyday, and I don't think that that's much appreciated. So I'll stop there.
Anmol, what inspirations, aspirations, and so forth along the way have you had?
I think the inspiration for me was when I started the university, I knew I wanted to go into the area of human reproductive science, because it's quite brand new. It's been there for the last 30 to 40 years, but there are a lot of areas to be researched, like for stem cells, or their success rate has to be improved for IVF and make it affordable in the third world countries. So like Deborah said, when you do a research, you become the part of the global world, and I had that aspiration that I want to make IVF affordable in third world countries and reduce the cost in Australia itself. So I think that was my inspiration to go into that sector and do my best and do research as well. The business side came along when I was like, okay, 95 research, that's good, but I should be doing more than that. I'm not a person that just can't sit on the computer every day and just typing grants or replying to emails. I'm more hands-on person. So I took on to the other roles, and some roles worked out for me and some didn't. So at being a part of a tutor or being a student ambassador or running companies is just part of my experience at the moment. And some experiences work out, some experiences don't. But like the panel said before, just follow your passion. I think following a passion is the biggest thing. And whenever I interact with the EA12s, I always say just follow your passion. Don't come under the pressure of your parents while you're doing your subject selections, because that this subject selection will land you to this job, or this subject selection will land you that job. They have lived their life. They don't have to sit the exam. You have to sit the exam. So just follow your passion. And there are a lot of career pathways that can lead into different industries as well. And I think with globalization, there's so much happening at a one given moment that we have to be aware of our surroundings. And you never show where you could use one skill or set of skills in a particular industry.
So if you look 5 or even 10 years ahead, Amol, where will you be?
I think I'll still be in Adelaide.
Sorry, I missed that one?
I'll still be in Adelaide.
In Adelaide.
I think the wine love would be keeping me here, but I think I'll still be researching, and I'm leading into a PhD next year, and I'll still be in the field of IVF, but and as well as getting that research experience and then trying to collaborate in the business world as well.
So will you have an academic job? Will you be on a fellowship, chasing grants all the time? What sort of life do you envisage yourself?
That's a tough question at the moment to answer if there are some employer seekers sitting over there. But I think after getting my PhD, I think I'll probably take some off and travel the world and get that off from the research area. But I'll look to diversify my business and expand my business as well, and started to invest more time in my companies, because at the time my team only sees me like 2 months in a year. So probably go invest more time in the business as well.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? One in the middle there.
Hi. Sorry. I'm Justin, by the way. Anyway, so I'm a part of, I've been speaking to a lot of students lately, and we're all finishing our honours, and we're all looking to either go into industry.
So you're writing your thesis too, huh?
I've done, actually. So I'm not stressed like poor animal over here. I hope it turns out well, by the way. There's a big discussion actually going on amongst all of us about the idea of doing a PhD. And so there's a big discussion about whether doing a PhD will make you overqualified for a lot of positions that are out there. And so like you were saying before, you have a lot of entry-level positions where you require an honours, but there's a big horror story that once you get your PhD, that just cuts out all of those jobs. But I've also read that a PhD is a lifelong, versatile qualification that you can literally apply anywhere. Now, since all these students are all too scared to bring that up to their supervisors because their supervisors want them to do a PhD, I was just wondering if you would like to comment on that and maybe dispel some of the illusions around that, because I've read a lot about it and I've kind of like convinced myself that it's a good idea, but there's a lot of others who are still arguing against it.
Deborah, why don't you?
Yeah, I did mention that entry level was an honours degree, but most of our employees do have a PhD. I would never discourage someone from doing a PhD if that was their passion. Like being a biotech CEO, it can be a long, hard road, very lonely at times, doing a PhD. But you discover a lot about yourself during that time as well. So I wouldn't discourage anyone from doing a PhD. When you complete, it's incredibly satisfying, and it's worth all that sweat, those late nights, and sometimes the self-doubt that comes along the way as you're doing the PhD as well.
I mean, there will be jobs that people wouldn't employ. Like, so if you were coming to a lab and applying for a job as a base technician, and you're being paid at that level, there would be the assumption that this would be pretty boring for you, and that this isn't really fair. So they may say, no, we're not choosing that type of person. It's not the kind of person we want. But I think it's the diversity of things that open up to you with the PhD. So if you're thinking strictly in that kind of environment, or going to other jobs which might not require any kind of skills at that level, then that may well happen to you. But think about the diversity of things that you could do. I should have actually brought I've got a slide from a book, and it was about a life sciences biotechnology related degree, and it was a tree diagram. And in the middle there's, you've done a degree. All these, then the whole tree, out in the branches and go out. There'd be hundreds of jobs around the edges of that thing. So, in law, patent law, for example, most people now who are patent lawyers in the biological sciences would have a PhD. There's fund management, so people who now manage the funds which fund companies such as Deborah, you'd be expected to have a PhD because it's the analytical skills that it brings to that. So I think there's a misinterpretation of the diversity of careers that you could go into where you use that high-level analytical skill. But certainly if you're thinking that the main career where you have a PhD in the research sector is going on to have run a lab and have a tenured position, very few of those around. I wouldn't even bother contemplating that. It may happen, but it certainly wouldn't be a career path I would recommend people put their mortgages on, because it's tough to do that. So, and that, as I said, that may need a bit more training. As a patent lawyer, you probably would do a degree, but we have one of my roles. I chair a cooperative research centre where you have a spin-off company, a company called Carina. It's in immunotherapies, and the chief executive officer of that is a patent lawyer, and he's a patent lawyer extraordinaire. And the fact that what he can do is take the patent law and analyse the science so well together, it's just amazing what skill that opens up. So, I think that's the sort of aspect. Yes, there will be careers that will be cut off, but it also opens up a diversity that would not be there.
Yeah,
and more the way science is becoming in this industry and growing globally. We've got a way to go in Australia yet. Often people say, well, gee, 70% of jobs are going to be requiring all this, technology, and they look around yourself and say, what, here? And it's one of my gripes about Australia, because we've come up from this commodities, grow it or dig it up and ship it out. But we're changing, and I think there's a recognition politically and whatever that we have to. So I think the future for people at the stage in this audience, diversity is only going to increase. Sorry, Deborah.
I agree, and actually, Leanna, I was thinking about the Bridge program. It's called the Bridge program. There's a website on it. It's about learning more about the biotech industry from a very practical perspective. It's a 3-day residential course with online assignments and so on. It's not very heavy because it's meant for people to fit in and around their day jobs. And it's a way of getting to understand the industry a little better. And so it might be something that appeals to some of you. I think they have an application round in February. It's funded through the Advanced Manufacturing in Pharmaceuticals, MTP Connect, which is a federally funded body which networks in the pharma biotech sector and particularly around manufacturing, but other initiatives as well. And it's run through Queensland University of Technology as the administrator, but they had the first of the 3-day residentials here in Adelaide a couple of weeks ago. And that might be something for those of you who are thinking about joining industry, just to get a little bit more familiar with what it's about.
Anmol, did you want to add to that?
I think, like you said, it's good to diversify, and I think the common myth at the moment is PhD, a postdoc, and a lab supervisor. But you could, like you said, you can use your analytic skills in different sectors, or you can work as a mediator between corporate world and scientific people, because there's a big push of commercialization of the researches you're doing. Or you can even work in the R&D department, or I've met some people in some companies where they have done PhDs and they're working as field specialists in a biotech company or pharma companies. So there are a lot of jobs options over there as well. So I think it's just to have your options open and diversify as well.
One of the challenges in this regard, I think, is when you go through research, and if you do things like honours and PhD and so forth, is to say, yeah, partly, am I pinholing myself into a certain career direction? But there are other things you can do as well. I think that, you know, if people are looking at you as in a job and one which perhaps has got to be multi-skilled, and most do these days, things like, you know, have you served on committees of, you know, the national bodies of whatever is your field you're in, for example, or local communities? Have you done the Institute of Company Directors course? That's something I'd recommend doing. So that indicates that you've actually got a little bit more broader thinking and exposure than because you're going to be, when you do a PhD, you've got to be, you know, you blinkered on that research and you're just going straight ahead with it. How do you diversify that? And Anmol has sort of been setting up companies and things, tutoring. So doing all these, a few of these other things are worth having around in your experience, bag of experience, that help, I think, perhaps not pigeonhole you in the way that you might have otherwise been. Other questions, please?
Thank you.
Oh, I've got a big voice, I don't think I need a microphone.
I can hear you.
I'm a school teacher and I represent a couple of kids here from Yorktown Area School on the York Peninsula.
Thanks for coming.
Cheers. I've gone through the whole biotech, doing honours and having a crack at PhDs and those sort of things. Coming out the other side, you've all mentioned that getting a job within the biotech and science area is not like other industries. You're a little bit bounded by 3-year funding cycles, and unless you've got strong industry links, job security may be indeed low. Do you think it's then wise for anyone going into this type of industry to only really be looking at the ones with projects or research questions with high industry links that then may go on to have job security into the future? Because I think it was you, Dr. Reid, you mentioned something about a mortgage. Some young people here might want to own a home one day. In science, you're not generally in it with a high money, but you might want to own a home. So what is your opinion, I guess, on having or doing a PhD or doing some sort of honours in an industry-based area?
More and more, I would say yes, because I think the future of people and their jobs and the whole industry is more with industry. It's got to be. There aren't going to be any more academic jobs. And there's been an explosion of people to fill those jobs because we've had deregulation, you know, of universities like, for example, the University of South Australia used to be a collection of colleges, you know, the Teachers College and all the rest of it. And then I guess dear old Dawkins decided in his wisdom to say they're all going to be universities. Now, of course, they'll all therefore aspire to be strong at doing research. The research dollars haven't gone up, so you're all competing for this. So it can be a pretty awful career to be on that 3-year grant cycle. You know, what's coming up? Am I going to have a job tomorrow? And sometimes you don't know, you know, a month or two out whether you're going to have a job or not. It's a tough environment to be in, and I would encourage people to sort of spread your skill base so that at least your options are higher. I'm glad to see you went into teaching. That's one we definitely need, because it's, as I said, you go back to that teacher I mentioned, the inspirational teachers. It's you who will change people towards that direction to do that. So yeah, and I think networking, looking around before you just go into, and I'll ask Anmol what he did in a moment. Before you go into something, say, okay, what does this offer me? You know, you might be chuffed that they're offering you a PhD or something, but do your homework on them. And I think the point you raise is very important. Are those people networked in ways that are going to help me in future? And industry link, and therefore getting that experience of working with industry. We're trying to do a lot more of that, more and more now. We had a session the other day, for example, where I had 35 postdocs come in the life sciences from 3 universities, and we had 5 companies, one of whom was ByNomix, come and say, tell these people what your challenge is. So not, I'm doing this research on this widget and somebody's going to want to fund my widget someday. Rather, the postdocs could start to think about the challenges that the companies have and make those networks and so forth. So we're trying to sort of do some more of that kind of thing. The more you can do individually and say, okay, I've done my homework on who I'm going to work with here. Anmol, for example, is in a very strong group in vitro fertilisation with very strong industry links. So I guess, would you like to comment on that, Anmol, about what how did you decide who to work with in your degree, honours degree, for example?
I think, like you said, at the end of the day, the thing comes to the networking, and I think it's good to be aware of what the industries look like and what are the different people look like. So when I went in the field of human reproduction, I did my industry homework. I knew I did homework on every individual person. I saw what sort of projects they were offering. Have they got a long-term goal? Have they got a short-term goal? Is there a commercialization side involved to it? So doing a background homework, and I think coming from a country like India where I didn't know the importance of networking, but coming here at a really early age, I came to know the importance of networking. Having those networks in the industry also does help you a lot, because someone might mentor you and you can go on from there. So I think doing your background homework, having networks in the field definitely does help you a lot.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Well, let's go back to myths. What are some other myths that we heard one up here? What's some other myths that you might want to dispel? Any ideas on that?
Well, actually, Leanna, as you were saying that there are unlikely to be jobs in academia, I was thinking about a generational change that might be coming, that might actually free up more academic jobs. I can remember when I was in primary school and Flinders University was built, and all of a sudden there were lots of new academic jobs. Well, a lot of those people are about to retire, so maybe that will actually open up a lot more opportunities in academia for people who, and I mean that's not just a Flinders type of phenomenon, but it's all sort of the non-sandstone universities like La Trobe and others. So maybe the picture isn't as dismal.
Maybe we need legalised euthanasia of ageing academics. Sorry, you had a point.
Another good myth, machine learning will put us all out of a job in 10 years.
Interesting.
It will, yeah, exactly, and it will change jobs. I often go back to that and say, well, the car was introduced in 1906, I think, the walk down in front of it with the flag type stuff, and if you go back and read commentaries at that point is, all these jobs are going to go, what are we going to do, and so forth. Well, we've obviously adapted. That doesn't mean certain people will not have pain of losing jobs, but the jobs will change. And actually, the point you raise on that, I think that the interface between technologies, the explosion of things that's happened in the last few years. Just look at, for example, the cost and time it took to map a genome. How long ago was that? Year
2000. Well, that was actually over a 10-year project at that point. To
and
map
now, what's $1,000 that'll come down to do that. The world is so totally changing. Or we were talking earlier about the fact that science tends to be hypothesis-driven. I'm doing research and I have a hypothesis and I will go and test it. But artificial intelligence is changing that totally. So things like mammograms. We're always taking images of people. You can analyse those images and find clues in there that the human eye wouldn't even see that will point to an early diagnosis. And we may not even know what that does, but it's an indicator. All that kind of the possibilities these things open up. And I think the health sciences is one of the biggest areas. Companies I'm involved in, I mentioned a spin-off from our CRC, is in immune therapies. And that's basically in the area where you take out, if you've got, in 10 years' time, you'll go to the doctor and and they'll say, I'm sorry, you've got liver cancer, but that's okay. Give me a bit of blood. We'll take your immune cells, T cells, out. We'll engineer them to recognise that cancer. We put them back in and they go and kill the cancer. And that may sound like it's just a fairy tale, but it is already being done. There are some just been approved drugs particularly for some of the leukemia, lymphoma type tumours in children, where these children were given 3 months to live because they had tried everything. 95% total remission. No, can't even detect the cancer by PCR, one of the sensitive techniques. So that's a changing world, and that stuff is coming to market quickly. The opportunities are expanding. And that's why in particular I say be entrepreneurial. Think about the possibility that you could start up a company, because it opens a whole range of doors, and it may not even be directly in the field you're in, but start up a company and you go off in medical tourism or something, and so forth. I don't think we do enough of that kind of thinking.
You mentioned about hypothesis-driven research. How do you go about the way of going to a traditional academic researcher and going with an idea presenting them with an idea that this is a real-world problem, and unfortunately, hypothesis-driven research is not going to cut it. We need to develop a brand new product, start brand new research. How do you go about changing their mindset, because you find an interesting link in collaborating with them, but they just can't think outside the box of hypothesis-driven?
Go to someone else. I'm not kidding. I mean, I've been looking at chief scientists. I'm trying to find people who are leaders in something. And I remember a thing back. This was actually in the energy sector, but trying to get people to do in a way what you're thinking. Think outside the square and come together. And some people just could not do it. All they were thinking of were these blinkered little projects. And I say, well, okay, that's not them. But there are people around who do that. I mean, we have, for example, a machine learning lab in Adelaide University that's in the top 4 in the world. They beat Google and at competitions and things. That sector has all these competitions and whatever. And they have been working. They're normally in robots and things, but they've been working with a local company here called LBT Innovations, which creates things like automated streaking for microbiology plates. And they developed an artificial intelligence way to look at the growth cultures, bacterial growths on plates, and come up with the answer of what the bacteria, what is that type of bacteria. And they can do it much more quickly and as efficiently as a human would do looking down a microscope. So you get those groups coming together. The people exist, but it's not everybody. And I'm quite serious. You go elsewhere.
And you see it in large companies like GE and others, for example, that are involved in imaging technologies, and particularly imaging of the brain. That's making some quite dramatic leaps. It's all about making. Some of you might have had, or your parents might have had, MRIs. Big machine, very, very loud and noisy and claustrophobic. And now people are working on really smaller machines that are quiet and that are using machine learning techniques, so artificial intelligence, to really image what's happening in the neural circuitry of your brain, and in particular brain regions. While you might be doing a task, does that task make you feel anxious? Does it make you feel depressed? Is it eliciting some other emotion or mood as you're doing something? And how is that affecting the way that different parts of your brain connect? So there's a lot happening in the oncology space, in the neuroscience space, and in other areas where artificial intelligence, machine learning is having a tremendous impact. And of course, the more that we can understand the brain and how it functions, obviously, the more that we can help people who have some sort of condition, but also we can help people become more productive and more engaged even in later life.
And there's a question, third row there.
Hello. As a purely practical question, I'm a science graduate. I know a few other science graduates, and it's been a few years. Some of us are working in labs in sort of doing jobs like quality control, things like that. We're in night fill, things like that, and that's all very well. You got to earn a living, but do you have any advice for people in that situation who may be interested in networking, in being a part of industry and biotechnology, to get back on the horse, for want of a better description?
Well, there's an organisation we have in South Australia called Tech NSA. It was called BioSA, but, so it had very much a life science focus. It's expanded now, which I think is great because of this. We're just talking about this crossover of technologies. Tech NSA is based down at Theberton, And they are a state government organisation which is designed in part to have these sort of networking type events. And they're open to anybody, often free. That kind of thing. So I think you go along and you might have a few drinks and someone will give a little bit of a talk and so forth. I think very valuable because you rub shoulders with people, and it's, at the end of the day, it's who you know usually that gets you places. So the more you can network, even if you're not one of those people person, and I'm not a people person, but you see some people who go into a room and absolutely network it with a list of business cards this high when they leave the room, but you don't have to be that person. But those sort of networking events, I think there'd be, all the universities would have, I guess, key seminars and often then sort of drinks and things afterwards that help that. And don't hesitate to go up and, if someone's giving a talk, you know, sometimes you think, oh, I won't go and talk to them, but, you know, do it. You know, just get out there and get outside your comfort zone and go do it. And Mol, would you add to that?
You know, I think I completely agree with you. I think it's just all about getting out of your comfort zone. And when the universities have like key sessions or anything like that, I've seen some students, they are quite afraid to just go and say hello to the speaker. I'm like, they're just a regular person, you know. And sometimes it's just things you drink over wine, discuss over wine. I was at an event and I met the director of the South Australian Future Leaders Forum, and she invited me to her next panel discussion she had. And from there on, I went to meet different directors, different CEOs. So I think just don't be afraid to go and say hello to different people in the room, and you never know. And I think, especially in the field of research, I always say go and talk to your supervisors, go and talk to the other researchers or the staff members in the university or in your area, because they are in the field, they know what's happening, they would be able to guide you where to go on from there.
We had things too, like Adelaide University, and we'll finish in a moment because we're out on time, had an event, I think it was a fantastic event, called Ingenuity. And it's a celebration of their effectively honours graduates in engineering. Engineering, you have to do a fourth year project, at least at Adelaide University, and but it's more or less like an honours project. And this was at the convention centre here, in one of those, in that big conference area over there, and all the students had their own booth and all their little show and tells and things, but they had lots of industry coming along to that. The public was invited. They had a number of schools. I think thousands of school kids came in. So that kind of stuff, have a look around what's on. The universities will advertise them because that was open to the public. So this is in the engineering field, but some of those kind of events, you know, you can go along and you can introduce yourself and network and, you know, get an understanding about what's going on.
Yes, and a couple of weeks ago, ByNomix hosted a symposium called Frontiers of Neuroscience, and the theme was feelings and forgetting. We had about 250 people attend that. There were stockbrokers, there were analysts from the financial industry, there were professors from Harvard University, from King's College London. It's held in conjunction with Merck MSD, and so there were lots of people in different scientific careers within Merck who were attending as well. And there were 20 students from Glenunga High School who attended. And our speakers were literally mobbed by those Year 11 and Year 12 students from Glenunga, asking all sorts of questions of the speakers. As I said, feelings and forgetting. So the talks were on anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, pain, Alzheimer's disease and sleep. Pretty interesting seminar if you get your rocks off thinking about those topics. But afterwards, there, not only in the breaks, but afterwards there was an opportunity to network amongst a pretty diverse group of people. And again, it was free, and we did advertise it pretty frequently through the university. So there's lots of opportunities that won't cost you anything other than some time to attend.
Okay, well, it's 3 o'clock, gone after 3, so we better finish that. So thank you all very much for coming. I hope we've been of use, and thank you, Deborah, for taking time out of your day, and Amol from your thesis. But, you know, someone's ahead of you up there, so get on with it. Good, and all the best for your future careers.
Thank you.